everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm honoured to be speaking with sports psychologist Joe Dixon. Joe, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
It's great to be on, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. Let's get cracking straight away, mate. Why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Absolutely. So I'm Joe Dixon, performance psychologist at Stoke City Football Club and Bath Rugby. I've been at Stoke now, 7 seasons, and Bath Rugby for just over a year now. So previous to that, I was actually an organisational psychologist and spent a few years working with businesses commercially across the globe. So maybe a different transition into sport from your usual type of sports psych. But having met many sports psychs, I think there's a variety of different stories, but that's me in a nutshell.
Fascinating, interesting background, mate. And I suppose it would be remiss of me not to ask you, do you find that there's a great deal of commonality between organisational psychology and sports psychology, or not so much? I can see the relationship, and obviously a lot of sports psychologists go on and work in business, but I personally think there are some big differences there, but you'd be more an expert than me. So what's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, initially I wasn't expecting there to be much use from my organisational psych experience going into sport, but actually first few weeks in my first full-time sport role, that was actually not the case. And found myself when working, give us a couple of examples, but certainly working with coaches, with senior leadership, at the level of developing, things like assessment procedures, recruitment procedures, competency frameworks, these types of things that actually now are utilised in sport environments almost as much as in business. So those skills were put to use. Definitely many differences in terms of daily life, but I do find myself dipping back in at times to those experiences.
That makes 100% sense to me, and I certainly, a lot of my reading within organisational business psychology helps me in my everyday work. I suppose one of the different areas I feel is that ultimately sport is about movement and motor skill, and enveloping that motor skill in a great mindset, I suppose, and that's where there are differences revolving around that. Having the capacity to having a mindset to execute your motor skills to the best of your ability, whereas there's not many cartwheels, forward somersaults, and golf swings done in the office. Perhaps there are in some offices, but
you'd be surprised.
Yeah. I suppose that's where I see a slight difference with how you might operate, but from a performance psychology perspective.
Yeah, and I was speaking to a friend who's a lawyer recently, and we was sort of comparing notes, and he sort of shone a light on it quite interesting, saying, well, actually, in your environments, you get really clear, structured feedback around performance daily, and athletes and coaches, whereas in his role, that might come once, twice a year in a performance review, and actually a lot of the time he's seeking out this stuff, and it was quite an interesting reflection for me in terms of actually just how lucky we are in terms of that ongoing development on a daily basis.
Wow. Part of your own development has been to write and edit a book. And that's been released this year, called The Psychology of Soccer. I see, like me, you've used the term soccer for your book and not football. A cunning marketing tool there, Joe, that you can take me through. But you co-authored and co-edited this with... You've got some big hitters out here, mate. Dr Jamie Barker, Professor Richard Thelwell, and Dr Ian Mitchell. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
I've read through the book, and as I say, you've contributed a chapter, but you've primarily been alongside Jamie, Richard, and Ian, the editor. So there's an assortment of authors, an assortment of topics. Take us through the process, mate. I mean, I want to talk about your chapter today because it's absolutely fascinating, your chapter. But take us through the process of this book. When did you start to envision it, and how did it come about?
Yeah, I guess the idea sort of started emerging in a high street coffee chain. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention that name. I don't know if it gets you sponsorship if I do, but yeah, it was sat there with Jamie Barker having a coffee. Jamie, who I believe you had on the show, and yeah, we were sort of bouncing around, just a boring Sunday afternoon, and I sort of put the idea to him to say, look, in my practical experience in football, I've drawn on colleagues, friends, but in terms of actual specific literature in the football space, there's not loads in terms of books and that I've drawn on. I could be wrong, and there'll be loads that I've not managed to get my hands on.
Clearly, Joe, there's Soccer Tough 2 and Soccer Brain as well, of course, that you've drawn.
Soccer Tough actually is a pride of place on my bookshelf. I don't know if that gets me any brownie points, but absolutely. I mean, Soccer Tough was one, obviously. Harwood's book, The Five C's, him and Anderson, Nestie's work. Those are great bits of literature that I have drawn on. But again, beyond that, we were sort of saying, well, actually, some great practitioners and people out there doing some fantastic work. Wouldn't it be great if we could maybe give them a platform to put a bit of that out there? And Jamie, being Jamie, very enthusiastic, and for me, it was just an idea, but he really got hold of it, and it's my first pilgrimage into the world of sort of book writing and literature, but he was an old hand, experienced of this stuff, and he really lit a fire under me in terms of getting that process moving. So from there, we quickly got Rich Felwell on board, who Jamie knows and vast experience, and Ian as well, who was keen. So yeah, straight away, fantastic team to start putting a framework together of what we wanted to get out there. I will sort of call you out, you're probably aware of this, but the word soccer actually originated in Oxfordshire in England. So for anyone it's usually the Anglo side of things that will challenge you on soccer, but that word I always come back and go, well, actually, it's a British word as well. So we've got that answer.
Does it derive from that's interesting? I mean, what I've heard, and I might be completely wrong here, but soccer association. So association football, soccer comes from association. Or am I wrong there, Joe? Does it come from somewhere completely different?
No, that sounds absolutely, that's my understanding. And again, it was, I was reading in an article on soccer myths recently, and that was one of the first ones that comes up that everyone goes, and particularly Brits who can be a bit snobby about this stuff. I use football, but I've got that in my. I can come back, and that's in my back.
Well, I'm going to use that from now on because I just claimed that mine was just a blatant marketing tool. So there we go. But never mind.
Well, that's what I'm trying to avoid that. Yeah, I probably agree with you. But yeah.
And look, before you tell us a little bit about the chapters in there briefly. I think it's a fascinating landscape. I mean, having been a pro golfer, I can go on to say Amazon and do a little search for golf psychology, and you're confronted with thousands of books there on golf psychology, and you're quite right. There's very, very little on football, soccer psychology. So it's a space waiting for people to fill it. I have to say, and in terms of filling things, I mean, your book is packed with chapters from some big players, some big hitters, some wonderful academics and practitioners from the world of psychology. Tell us a little bit about the contents of the book before we crack on with your chapter.
Yeah, sure. So 20 chapters, I think it works out to around about 46 authors we got on board. Very lucky, and we were just overwhelmed really with the actual willingness to contribute, sign up, get involved, and use this platform to really shout out a massive thank you to all those, because they gave up their time, their expertise to make this book what it is. And we I guess initially we had a framework of ideas around, a list of potential topics that we wanted to look at, and it was absolutely vast, which I guess leaves us open to the Psychology of Soccer Volume 2 if we ever go down that route. But I think we put together a list of potential areas we wanted to cover, then map that with individuals that we know who are working out in the field, who have done work in these various areas, and went about contacting them. What we ended up with was 20 chapters. We've broken those down into 4 sections. So chapters evolved around working with, specifically the psychologists working with individuals and teams, so facing those individuals. Section 2 more about working through others, so psychologists who might work through, say, coach in terms of having an impact on a group. Section 3 was chapters that focused around working in the actual environment, so how you operate in that performance space. And the final section was focusing in on how psychologists may work to support athletes with physical or mental health challenges. So approximately 5 to 6 chapters in each area, we found a real vast wealth of different experiences, which I think sums up for me just how varied different sports psychologist roles are working in the sports soccer at this current time.
So great for sports psychs and aspiring sports psychs, but also really useful for coaches to read.
Absolutely, and we I guess the blurb on the book says for aspiring practitioners, for those working in sport, but also those from a more multidisciplinary perspective, including coaches, because it just highlights how important the role and actually having that engagement, those relationships are going to make the role of a sports psychologist more effective. Certainly, and I'm just speaking from my own experiences, so you give the example of the coach, understanding how they might utilise this particular role in their particular team or coaching space.
Interesting, and look, certainly the chapter we're going to talk about today, the chapter you wrote, I think is super relevant for coaches and a must read for them. Your chapter, co-written with Professor Mark Jones, is entitled A Challenge Culture. So we're going to be revisiting the theory of challenge and threat states today, and for listeners, you can supplement this today's Sports Psych show by listening to my chat with Dr. Carla Mayen, who was one of the original authors of Challenge and Threat States, and that's in episode 62. Do a deep dive into Challenge and Threat States with Dr. Jamie Barker, episode number 71. And I believe that Dr. Paul McCarthy had a big part in developing this theory. He's in episode 80, and obviously Dr. Martin Turner from episode 5 has also done a lot of research in this area. So plenty of resources on the Sports Psych show for all listeners if you want to do more of a deep dive on challenge and threat states. But I think to start off, Joe, talk to us a little bit about the background to this chapter, and then take us through challenge and threat state, what those states actually are and how they're relevant to sport.
Yeah, so I've been at the football club, as I said, for 7 seasons now, and part of that has allowed me to conduct research in that space as well. So we've conducted mixed methodology research, so we've done some qualitative stuff with the coaches, we've done some quantitative testing of players pre-performance, looking at their challenge and threat states, and we've done and the chapter that went into the book was an ethnographic based piece around my role evolving over a period of years, what that entailed, and going into the role within the academy. One of the big areas that the focus was to implement a psychological skills program, and that was based on the theory of challenge and threat states, which you've mentioned there. Some great academics, practitioners who've worked with this, and it is very much a growing popular theory utilised in sport. So the chapter is looking over my work during those years, how the program was implemented, how it was evolved, how we examined what challenge and threat looks like in that performance space. And all in between really. So it highlights some of the challenges where we've looked to look at impact, and it does. Reading back on it, it's sort of like, wow, it's the roller coaster of working as a sports psych in sport.
Well, I agree with that. Completely appreciate it. Look, before we do a deep dive as to what challenge and threat state is, you used a word there, ethnographic. What is an ethnographic research?
I guess in layman's terms, a qualitative methodology where your researcher observes, interacts with participants in their real life environment. So it is used across a wide range of social sciences, different modes of ethnographic research. Obviously, I was in there participating, being part of it at the same time. So different modes of evidence, observations, interviews, case studies. You can utilise a broad range of and it did, someone who's, it was my first stab at this type of research. An interesting endeavour, and markedly different from, say, the pre-match quantitative testing that I undertook with players. So I guess, does that sum it up in a nutshell, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what I'm taking from that is you're out in the field there, you're in the environment, you're in the competitive environment, the environment of the club, and you're observing and you're gathering information from what's going on around you. You're doing that through observation, but also through interviews, and also getting data from the work you're doing within that environment, getting feedback and various measurements. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And an element of because you're participating in the work, the reflection pieces as well form a massive part.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I just think that's such a crucial way for us to work as sports psychologists. It's obviously not, as you're saying, it's not the only way. It's what we would describe as a qualitative form of research, and it's not the only way. But for me, what happens out in the field and being able to interpret that, in the moment, in the environment, is so vital. Now, challenge state, threat state. Tell me a bit about these states, Joe. What do they mean? Let's start there.
Yeah, to sum it up, how we respond to motivated performance situations. So as performers, how we might respond to a perceived stressful situation. And it's psychophysiological states, so meaning our thoughts affect what goes on physiologically for us. And we can get ourselves in a positive state of performance, a challenge state, or a negative state of performance, based on actually what our cognitions are doing. And if our cognitions, our thoughts, are more aligned to positive things, our resources, then the literature, the research tells us that we're more likely to drive a challenge state in ourselves, which physiologically, and again, go back to your previous podcast that will go a deep dive in this, but physiologically, our heart rate is going to pump more blood and all the energy and bits we need to the areas of our body that needs them in a challenge state, ready to perform and go and execute those motor skills and that we need. In a threat state, conversely, actually negative thoughts, and we're more focused on the demands of the situation at hand, which has a negative effect on us physiologically, which actually means that we are not, our heart rate doesn't pump as fast, our arteries don't open up as quick, and it means that we are not getting those nutrients to and the blood to the areas of the body that need to perform. And that's the physical. That's also our cognitions and decision making and all those things in between that are massively important to go out there and perform in our relevant sport.
I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating because it's just so relevant, and I think sometimes that these things are not just imperceptible but invisible to people's, I suppose, to coaches' perceptions of what's going on. What I'm hearing from you is players perceive a competition in a particular way. So if I have a competitive outing at the weekend, I'm playing a competition, I will perceive that, evaluate it positively or negatively. As simple as that, positively or negatively. I will have a physical reaction to that positive or negative perception. I will have a bunch of thoughts, cognitions related to that perception. Emotion comes into it as well. And if I perceive things positively, I enter into what could be described as a positive energizing state, and that's the challenge state. If, in contrast, I perceive it in a negative way, so for example, as you said there, I focus on the really tough demands that I've got coming. The opposition are going to be so good. We're playing Liverpool. We've got no chance. They're so good, right? Then I fall into this negative, maybe de-energizing state, and that's our threat state. So challenge state, threat state. Would that be a fair summary?
Wonderfully put, yeah, and I think if going back to work of Turner and Barker, they like the idea of tipping the balance. So what we're looking to do is tip the balance in the favour of those resources. There's the positive stuff that's going to drive a challenge state versus the demands of the situation, which will get us in that de-energized space. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, what you're talking about there is Jamie and Martin's brilliant book, Tipping the Balance. And in terms of tipping the balance, what resources actually tip the balance, Joe?
The research literature that's out there highlights three areas: so confidence, control, and approach focus. So confidence comes in a variety of forms, as I'm sure you've covered off in the podcast. Control, focusing on those areas that are in your control as an athlete, and approach focus, looking forward to what's going to energize you, what you're going to achieve. And I guess if you look at the opposites to that, the things, focusing on things that are going to limit confidence, reduce confidence, impact on your belief that you perform. Focusing on things. Go on.
Yeah, no. Let's break that down, actually, because I think this is really interesting. So we've got three things that mediate. We've got confidence, we've got control, we've got approach focus. I know the research talks about self-efficacy being this number one source of challenge and threat state. But you've used in your chapter, I love the fact that you've used the term confidence. And I'm very mindful that you've co-written this chapter with Professor Mark Jones. So I suppose my perception has always been that there's a difference between self-efficacy and confidence. So on the one hand, if I read the literature going back 6-7 years, the original literature that Professor Mark Jones and Dr Carla Mayen and others wrote, they talk about self-efficacy. You've used the term confidence. Take me through that. I love that. How comes you guys have gone down this path of using the term confidence?
Yeah, I think initially for us, and in a practical space, and you could probably challenge us on definition, but I think for us in the environment of a professional football academy, self-efficacy doesn't necessarily sit or land well, and it's not the terminology that's out there. So whilst initially going in with it's self-efficacy and that's how it's used in the literature, we ended up, it was just actually more natural for coaches, players to move towards this term confidence because it is used widely in professional sport. Having said that, I think it's really important to understand what confidence means in, say, for our particular work that's being done. So giving that a definition rather than actually just saying confidence, which if you ask 10 different people, it can mean many different things. And we said about the quality piece I mentioned initially around the work we did with coaches was looking at these terms and how actually coaches do define, and particularly this word resilience that's thrown out, because we talked about that a lot, and how different coaches would look at resilience, and it was found that there are many different ways. It turns out there are many different contrasting ways of defining, looking and explaining what it is.
But you had no problem using those terms interchangeably. I mean, I certainly wouldn't challenge this, because I think definitely when I read about self-efficacy and I think about my experiences at the coalface, I think that, I mean, clearly confidence sits better with coaches and athletes than, say, self-efficacy. Some will use the term self-belief, and I know Albert Bandura is basically saying self-efficacy is self-belief, but he would differentiate between self-belief and confidence. Confidence a more sort of global, less tangible thing, whereas self-efficacy, self-belief being more about the belief you have in the skills that you've got in order to make a difference to an outcome. It's my understanding of how he would define that. But I, if anything, Joe, it's kind of for you and Professor Mark Jones to sit down and use that interchangeably and actually say, no, this is what we're experiencing at the coalface. It's fantastic to see that, because I think that's so important. And I think for some practitioners and for some people who read, say, the challenge and threat states and the self-efficacy research, they're a bit scared to use the term confidence, because it's like, well, is that different? Is that the same? Am I doing the right thing here? Because you want to keep it evidence-based. Can you see where the challenge as a practitioner comes from in that respect?
Totally, and as I said, going in initially with that idea of self-efficacy, and you could probably map back the work, it probably lies more in that definition that you provided of self-efficacy. But yeah, being actually able to go, look, this term is maybe not sticking, and even so, there's something that's going to get more traction in that performance space, and people are going to buy in and go, actually, this is the language that we want to use. So yeah, and it's not easy, because I think going in, I sort of mentioned at times in the chapter around, look, I'm going in using the theory of challenge and threat states to implement and build a program, but there's so much beyond that theory that you have to adapt and use, and it's not just challenge and threat, but so actually being able to be flexible, adaptable, touch on different theories, touch on different approaches, and it was a big learning as I went along, because you can't be, in my experience, again, other practitioners might challenge that, but you can't be rigid and just go, look, it's got to be this theory, this way, this language, because ultimately it's going to limit what you get in return.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well said. So the idea here is creating a challenge culture. We want players, we want coaches to be able to attain a challenge state when they're performing. Source number one is confidence. So you've gone into to the football club and you've started to help players and coaches develop confidence, self-efficacy, self-belief, in order to attain a challenge state. How have you done that, Joe? What things have you engaged in, and have you had the people at the club engage in order to develop confidence? What were some of the challenges, pardon the pun, there that enabled people to develop confidence?
Yeah, a broad range of things have been done, and the program certainly has evolved over 7 odd years. I think initially big education piece around what it is, individuals understanding sources of confidence, areas which might impact on potential confidence levels, and bearing in mind that the program ranges from young children from the age of 9 up to under 23s in the academy. So that would look very different depending on who we might be working with. I mean, at a very young age, it's all about fun and introducing these very basic terms and language, and that might be through the coaches, certainly. A big piece as the program has evolved, it has been, impacting the environment through the coaches and how they might support players in individually or in their training plans, in terms of bringing out areas where they can show areas of strength, for instance, that develop confidence, to give really strong, effective feedback. More broadly, parents, working with parents and helping them understand how their conversations with their children post-game on the way home in the car, for example, might impact on confidence levels. Again, I could probably give you an hour on the work that's been done across over these 7 years, but I think importantly they've been done at a group level with coaches, with particular individuals at times, if there's unique support required. But yeah, I think the breadth is probably coming across here in terms of the type of work. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, there was some specific things there I heard, helping players focus on strengths, feedback, so coach-athlete feedback. In terms of feedback, is there anything specific there that you might recommend coaches engage in when they're talking with players in terms of developing confidence?
I think one of the big things are effective questioning skills. So not just you shining a light on this stuff for players, but do they spot where they've had a good session, their strengths, the things they've done well today? Because I'm reading an interesting book at the moment, Baumeister, The Power of Bad, and just the idea is, as humans, that we tend to, I think that the ratio gives for every bad thing, we need 4 good things to happen to outweigh it. We're kind of wired to be quite negative as a species at times. So even if you speak to athletes, they come off, and if one thing's happened that hasn't gone quite as well, they'll amplify that massive. And same with I guess going back to players, helping players and coaches building effective reflection skills has been a core part of the work to help drive confidence levels.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned Baumeister. That's, for the audience, that's Roy Baumeister, who's actually a world authority on self-control, willpower, which was his first book, and that new book is The Power of Bad, as you say. And it reminds me of the work of Barbara Friedrichsen within the domain of positive psychology. I think she's a long-term colleague of Martin Seligman, who is the originator and founder of positive psychology, and that I think she talked about 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio, intentionally trying to have a 3 or 4-to-1 ratio of positive to negative, because we have a propensity as human beings through our survival mechanisms towards negative emotion rather than positive emotion. So what I hear you say that Joe, is it should be incumbent on coaches to help players to reflect on what went well, what was working, what was positive, as a mediator of confidence, to then help players move on to that challenge state.
Absolutely, yeah, spot on.
Moving on to the second source, control. I just think this is so important, because for me, I don't know what you found, Joe, in your consultancy practice, embedded. And hey, look, I was so guilty of this as a pro golfer, so I know how challenging this is. My language and the language I experience daily within my consultancy work from players tends to lean towards things that are out of their control. Their focus orientates towards things that there's almost this magnetic force field that leans towards factors that are out of their control. So talk to me a bit about control, because this is the second mediator of challenge and threat.
Yeah, you can't see me, but I'm sitting here nodding along because, it's you speak to. I mean, if you're a sports psychologist working in the field, you'd be nodding along as well. You'd have come across athletes, no doubt, that are so prone to just focusing on things that they really can't impact or affect, and a lot of their mental and physical energy can be drained by these things. So yeah, absolutely, I think, and that's governed a lot by. Can be by just self-talk that's driven towards things that athletes, player, team members, and even coaches that can't be affected. So again, educating our young athletes, our coaches around this idea of locus of control, and there's things that can't be affected. There's things that can be influenced, certainly, by actions, but there's things that actually really we have control over. Now, the ideal is to really for individuals to be in that space of the things they can control. There might be some time where you have to dip into the stuff and the stuff you influence and address those things, but we certainly wouldn't want them spending all their thoughts, their mental energy on that big space outside of that, which is all those things that you can't control. And it can range from weather to the opposition you're facing to, you name it, to being on TV or selection decisions. There's so many things, but we find ourselves working with individuals that get drawn into that stuff quite often.
And it strikes me this is a little exercise that coaches can do, grassroots coaches can do, even if it's just a couple of minutes at the beginning of a session, is just to throw some thoughts out there in terms of, you mentioned it, the weather. Can we control the weather? Can we control the state of the pitch? Can we control the referee? Those are obvious things. Whether I've been picked to play. And just start a conversation. Just start a conversation with players. Just get that going, so you can then build momentum, and it's something you can come back to when you've got a player who's, say, stressed because of the state of the pitch. A young player is, this pitch is awful, I'm bound to lose control and I'm going to make mistakes. If you've started that conversation already, it opens up the possibility to then reinforce at a later date when it's going to be very relevant.
Yeah, absolutely, and the point you make is putting it on potentially the idea of staff and coaches, because the language that's used, the questions you ask can steer their athletes towards the more focus on themselves rather than these external factors, which is so important.
The final source, approach focus. I mean, I think a lot of coaches now would be certainly well versed in confidence. Probably pretty well versed now in the notion of control and focusing on the things that one can control. But approach focus, what does that mean? What does that look like? How can coaches help players direct their approach focus, or towards direct their attention towards an approach focus?
Yeah, and for me, it's probably best described in the context of its opposite, the opposite being avoidance focus. And when you put it and you start talking about working with individuals in a place where they're in an avoidance focus state, they're focusing on things that they want to avoid. So it's fear of failure. So statements like, I don't want to be the worst performer. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want to give the ball away. These are all avoidance focus type statements that, again, you speak to athletes, you find them just bandied around in that performance space at times, and individuals do get themselves in this way of thinking pre-performance. approach focus is the opposite. So it's almost taking the devil's advocate or challenge to that question. Okay, so what are you looking for? What are you excited about? What if you perform well, what's that going to look like? What do you want to get out of this today? And actually really flipping the coin of what you want to get out of it. And straight away you notice in the language, in people's physical responses when you ask those types of questions, that there's already a energized response. And similar mention around control, the importance of practitioners, of staff, to they can influence that by asking these sort of questions, by putting statements out in their various team talks or feedbacks that get their athletes excited, energized, not getting them in that opposite where, the typical thing you might hear on the side of a football pitch, like, don't give the ball away, don't make a mistake.
Don't foul. Don't foul. That's the big one for it. Don't foul.
That's the big one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that type of language that again is so you hear it, it's natural, again unconscious at times, but it can be so impactful in terms of getting an athlete in more of an avoidance focused state.
Interesting. Now, there's conversations afoot, I understand, in the challenge and threat state academic world around a potential fourth source. Big breaking news here, and I would revert the audience onto number 52, show number 52 with Dr. Matt Slater. We talked about social identity theory, because I know Professor Mark Jones, I think behind the scenes with Matt and others, and yourself, starting to realise that social support might make a difference. I think Dr. Jamie Barker also spoke about this in episode 71. Social support possibly impacts that challenge and threat state. Would that be right? And you've certainly written about it here in this chapter.
Yeah, great to hear you're up on your research, Dan, and
all over it, Joe. All over it.
That there's a paper that's come out recently, Jones et al. that do factor in the social support into the revised TCTSA work. So absolutely, this idea that the individuals around us can really impact on how we respond to motivated performance situations. So yeah, that was starting to emerge very much in my time in the academy. So and again, they've taken that on and built that into the model, which is great, because I think it's certainly prevalent how we go about supporting each other as a group, and in that performance space will impact on how we respond to stress. So I think there's certainly a lot of research out there highlighting how this stuff can predict increased performance. It actually shows that social support is associated with more coping, dealing with stress. Oxytocin, which is a hormone that helps in terms of dealing with stress, is released during these positive social contacts that we have, and having that and reduces the severity of the body's stress response. So these types of things that have been shown in research over the years actually that Jones and Mark and his team have factored into the new theory.
Well, you mentioned oxytocin there and spoke a lot about oxytocin with Joan Ryan, related to team chemistry and her brilliant book. And, just coming back at you there, Joe, it strikes me that social support has a well-being piece to it, a mental health piece to it, because, thinking about these three sources, they feel quite performance-oriented or overtly performance-oriented: approach, focus, control, confidence. On the periphery, now we're starting to look at the relationship between social support and challenge and threat state. surely there's a well-being piece in there as well. Well-being versus ill-being. If I'm engaged in any form of kind of ill-being, if I'm not feeling great about myself, then it's got to be tougher, surely, to get into a challenge state. I might be wrong. Please come back at me there. Surely it's tougher to get into a challenge state and lends more towards a threat state. I'm also thinking of identity, burnout, injury. I'm sure there's many more factors that other sports psychologists are screaming at me in the car right now, but there must be some periphery factors here that maybe come under that banner of social support, or perhaps sit outside of that, and things are developing and emerging that way. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly see, and again, practitioners would certainly, there's been a debate around that wellbeing performance space and where we sit along that continuum, but for me, being in my own experiences, they absolutely go hand in hand. And actually, just reverting back to the idea of the oxytocin, I mean, it is associated with a challenge state, but also a healthier recovery after stress as well. So it's about leading up to performance and dealing with those stresses, but also returning back, and maybe some of these traditional ideas or definitions of resilience, bouncing back. So actually having support, being able to be in a group and connect with those individuals, and also all those things associated with social sport is a massive link to well-being. And I'd like to think, certainly in our environment, we pay massive attention to that with not only our players but staff as well.
Really interesting stuff. I've got a couple of questions for you around challenge and threat states. Could there be? There's times when I've competed, and I'm sure there's times where I've perceived the competitiveness of, let's say, a client that I've worked with, whereby, and from the feedback that they've given me, whereby one could say I was in, or they were in, a challenge state, but it also it kind of felt more than that, where that positive energy was for some reason greater. I was in a state that went beyond that. Have you experienced that in your work? Do you think there's such a thing? Does the challenge and threat state work on some kind of continuum whereby you can be in low challenge and high challenge, so you can be in almost a better challenge state, as well as high threat and low threat, like that you're in a threat state but it's not so bad, whereas in your low threat and it's just, hey, I experienced that as a golfer, I know that, and every shot was just painful. Can there be a continuum there? Can there be high challenge and low challenge?
It's a great question, because it's something that I've really reflected on, and what does that look like? Is it high emotional arousal? Is it the body language that you're seeing? Is it actually, when we do these tests on athletes, the way the heart's responding? And in all honesty, I guess I'm just going from my observations and anecdotal evidence, a bit like you. I think potentially yes. I think there's so much more research that we need to do in this space, because I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg, and I think we're conscious of that in all the work that's been done within sport. So short answer, yes, but I think I would love to be and be involved in that research as well, because I think it whets your appetite to see just how when we used the quantitative methodology I mentioned to get the athletes' readings before performance and what that looked like, and even how we measured performance after these things. Again, we're using relatively, I say, rudimentary ways of measuring performance, for instance. So I think all those things have got ways to go to really develop, understand, and take this theory and its practical application to the next level.
So with that in mind, and again, this is just an opinion piece here, Joe. If we think about something like the flow state, and I'm I'm not always convinced about the notion of a flow state. I'm sure something exists there, as you're kind of mentioning or alluding to, that there might be something there where we go into this ultra positive energy mode or whatever, and time slows down or time speeds up, and we feel we've got so much more time. Have you had conversations with the relevant people, Professor Mark Jones, Martin Turner, Jamie, Matt, around flow state? Do you guys feel is there a relationship between challenge state and flow state at all?
I think, again, my interpretation, Jamie, Martin, Mark, I won't necessarily speak for them, but
no, of course.
that challenge state is the pre-performance and going in. So actually how you approach a stressful situation, the flow state, again, for me, and again, emerges during performance, where you find actually things are, like you described, coming off naturally, time slows down. So the stress almost has been managed, and you're actually on that, pathway towards, excellent performance.
Yeah, Dr. Carla Mayen and I spoke about this a little bit, and obviously we don't quite have the equipment to be able to measure that challenge state in the moment in many activities that are obviously a bit more rigorous. So, as you say, challenge state is very much about how I'm my mental state approaching the competition. So it's I suppose it's one for future research, and dependent on the kind of technology that exists in the future.
Absolutely.
My last question there is, can competitors compete optimally in a threat state, do you think?
Yes, and I've seen it and worked with individuals who clearly pre-performance and were working and getting themselves worked up to a state where I think if we'd have measured them physiologically, I'd be fairly confident that their heart rate would be showing up signs of a threat state. And these are individuals that actually just normalise some of this stuff over time for me, and it's just part of what I know. This is what I need. This is how I've always done it, and not always, but occasionally we've been able to challenge some of that and just get the athlete to try actually to address some of these things. Again, come across an athlete that was sick prior to every performance and nerves, and as an example, and that was just what they did, and physically vomiting before going out there and performing. All the things associated with them in terms of the way they described their thoughts and behaviours beforehand. I guess if you stuck the thermometer, the bit of equipment we use with our footballers on them, I guess they'd be in a threat state. But they were still going out and posting, really good performances out there. So I have seen it, but it's not to say that a challenge state wouldn't even bring a better performance and also better coping with the situation of being a professional athlete.
That's really interesting, because you said in there an athlete might say this is what I need, this is what helps me. So they obviously wouldn't have used the language of threat state historically, but if they say, well, what you're seeing here for me, vomiting, pacing up and down the room, thinking negatively about an upcoming performances, or what could be perceived as thinking negatively, if their perception of that is that actually helps me, so that's still a threat state, but it's a threat state that leads to some form of state that enables them to compete, and you as a practitioner also casting a skeptical eye on that and potentially challenging that as well. So there's this juxtaposition between the player is saying, hey, this helps, and as a practitioner you've got to be able to be nimble enough to go, okay, this might actually help. So a threat state might actually put somebody in a position to be able to be in some kind of state that helps them to perform. However, you also casting a mindful eye on this actually might not help as well. We could actually put this person, get them to experience a challenge state, and that might help them even more.
Yeah, and I think with that well-being hat on that we spoke of as well, there's that if you're seeing said athlete get so worked up to a point where, you think, long term this isn't good for them, then actually shining a mirror on some of that stuff is, I think there's definitely a duty as well for some of that. Going back to the original point, I think as well that we've in the research we did with our footballers, we found that it was actually the blunted ones that perform worse, so the ones that didn't actually respond in any cardiovascular way, so just normal. So the challenge state athletes perform the best, then the threatened athletes, but it was the blunted ones that we found from a performance perspective showed the low scores.
Don't be dead inside.
Exactly that.
Either be extraordinarily excited or extremely terrified, but don't be in between.
Exactly, don't. Spot on.
And don't be in an approach state. Listen, final couple of minutes, it would be remiss of me not to talk a little bit about measurement. And obviously it's challenging to do certain forms of measurements for coaches who don't have hold of equipment, but there is a piece in your chapter in the book here that talks about how you measured success. Talk to me a little bit about how you went around doing that.
Yeah, and it is challenging in that space of being in a performance environment. So you're constantly looking at ways to evaluate and get feedback, and it's not always forthcoming, so you have to search for that stuff. So I think the important piece initially is that self-reflection, which you have to do. And at the time, my supervisors, Mark and Martin, were also fantastic. That's Mark Jones, Mark Turner, were brilliant in terms of being people who you could share experiences with and bounce ideas off and get their thoughts and feedback. In the performance space, feedback from and going and seeking it out from coaches, building in feedback into your workshops, your sessions with players, giving them the opportunity to give you honest, open reflections on what's working. If you're working with an individual athlete, then you're building in measures in terms of whether that's observational, self-reports, areas where they can reflect on the work that's being done and track any improvement. So it's, I mean, the challenge, there's still many ways to do it. You would ask people to come out and observe any work that you're doing to get their reflections on it. Because again, I'm coming into space, I've got to adapt to the culture, the language, the ways of working, and make it stick versus the other way around. They've got to suddenly all this new concepts and language to them. So that's a big piece, and across different age groups. So how do you making a session enjoyable and relevant for I guess a foundation phase like 9s to 12 group? It's very different to perhaps working with a group of under 23s. So yeah, I think every day you're searching for those ways of looking at your impact, and from the most obvious thing to the performance reviews you have with your line managers and seeing how they're reflecting on the work that's being delivered from whether it's head of coaching, the academy manager, and seeing the impact you're having.
Interesting. Great stuff, Joe. I want to finish on a quote, and it's a quote you use to open your chapter. And I'll get your comment on this, but I think it neatly brings everything together in a way that really translates all of this. It's a quote from the England first team manager Gareth Southgate. It was prior to the 2018 World Cup knockout game against Colombia, which England went on to win. Gareth Southgate says this. He said, "We have to concentrate on our own football, playing in the style we have throughout the tournament and playing with the same mentality. We have to show the resilience and the freedom we've played with up to this point. I want the players to continue to attack the tournament as we have. That shouldn't change in the knockout stage. We should feel freer, if anything, because these are the sort of matches you want to be involved in. The lads have the chance to write their own stories now. And I'd love to get your comment as to why you put that in. For me, I mean, even the last sentence there, the chance to write their own stories, their inner narrative, their stories, writing your own story, playing with freedom, attacking the tournament, concentrate on our own football. There's so many little things there that relate to challenge and threat state. It's said in a language that I think a lot of coaches will be familiar with, but the underpinning foundation there could be perceived as this challenge and threat state.
Yeah, I absolutely love this quote because for me it encompassed all those elements that we talk about under resources. So the positive traits of the players that they're demonstrated in the tournament up to that point, very much areas that the players were in control of, and what they're looking to achieve. That the stories that they could achieve moving forward. So that approach focus, all wrapped up in this idea of we. They create a collective group leading into this idea of social support amongst them. So it wasn't just this quote. I think Gareth Southgate is an individual. Every time you hear him speak, his language consistently highlights areas that you go, well, that ties in massively with the theory of challenge and threat and all the areas that we've spoken about. So again, not worked with him individually, but know from what the type of environment he creates. So I think this stuff, for the way he addresses it and utilises it is an example that we'd hold up as someone that does this really well at an elite coaching level.
And it's obviously worth noting that Gareth Southgate works closely with one of the co-authors, co-editors of this book. Yeah,
absolutely. Ian is heavily involved with the England first team and that group. So I think with Ian's experiences there as well, just noting, I think he would certainly have tapped into many of the work that's done across these chapters in this book to support the team.
Absolutely. Well said. Joe, to finish off, I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience, so I think the first thing is, how can people get hold of the book? Just remind us of the title and how they can get hold of it, and how can people follow you and contact you if you want to be followed and contacted, that is.
Yeah, sure. So your typical Amazon location is probably the best place to get hold of the book. It's published by Routledge, Taylor and Francis, so you can go directly to them. But Amazon's you're probably your best bet. It's The Psychology of Soccer, published this year, 2020. Myself, Jamie Barker, Rich Thelwell, and Ian Mitchell. In terms of myself, I am on Twitter, Dr Joe Dixon. I must admit I'm not a prevalent Twitter user, but occasionally you'll get your tweet from me, but you certainly can contact me via that Twitter handle.
Brilliant. Joe, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Dan. It's been great. Cheers.
Wow, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch on Twitter or via Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.